sure most, if not all of you, have seen this, and this is how the national organizations work together. NPPC works with the National Pork Board. Bill's going to speak here in a little bit, as well as working with state organizations. We're funded voluntarily with voluntary contributions from producers. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. And 40% of the funding that NPPC receives from producers goes back to the state of origin to do the same things NPPC does, which is legislative, trade policy, regulatory activities, and we'll talk about those in a second. We have our mission, NPPC's mission, is to be the global voice of the U.S. pork industry. We do that in three particular program areas. One, of course, is legislation and regulation. As Leon said, we have an office in Washington, D.C. In fact, we're joined by our former head of that office, Kirk Farrell, that carries on the bulk of that programming. Also in Washington, D.C., we have a group of individuals that work on trade policy, which is the second bubble up here, the middle one, that talks about marketing opportunities. And for us, it's about how do we get access internationally. In fact, it's led by Nick Giordano on staff, who happens to be in Thailand at the present time. So he does quite a bit of travel throughout the world, working on issues of trying to access markets for U.S. pork, as well as, most recently, because of the success of exports, trying to keep those markets open. So, and I'll talk about exports in a second. Then finally, our third charge is to protect producers' livelihood. It's not just producers, it's the whole industry's livelihood, the ability to be in business without cumbersome, undue restraints. Now, you know, every football game needs a referee, and the pork industry needs referees too. But the point is that you need to let the players play, and we try to keep that atmosphere working. I'm going to talk about legislative regulatory activities, our SIP LEADR progress, just to give you a little update on where that's at for Iowa, and then talk about trade a bit. And this has been quite a year for NPPC. It's really been a culmination of 3 or 4 or 5 years of efforts that happened to culminate in 2011 with a number of successes. One was the second lawsuit against the EPA related to confined animal feeding operations, was in the Fifth Circuit Court in New Orleans. And the issue going on with that right now, if you're not familiar, is the fact that you've got the EPA's Office of Water Quality is attempting to put in a national regulatory scheme that would require all confined animal feeding operations to register with ultimately through the state to the federal government, or if your state doesn't have what's called delegate authority, to the federal government. And NPPC is very much opposed to that. Now, in several states like Iowa, those entities that are permitted are already on a database. Our concern, however, is that it does not do any positive good to have a large national database unless you're an environmental organization that wants to target somebody, or even worse, and we've involved the Department of Homeland Security in this, if you have ulterior motives to basically get an electronic database showing all the livestock production sites, and that's strategic to this country for food animal usage. So that's part of what our fight with EPA is. Two things happened with the Grain Inspection Packers and Stockyards rule. One, what was proposed and would have been a tremendous travesty for the industry from my perspective was reworked, and what had been the original 2008 Farm Bill, a rule had been proposed that dealt with the 4 things that were talked about there. The other additional kinds of things that would have actually literally switched around the business atmosphere in this industry were withdrawn, have not been published. And in addition to that, NPPC, together with what we call the barnyard, other ag, particularly livestock groups, were successful in getting funding to implement the rule and to work on the rule ceased in this year's budget. Now, come next October 1st, there'll be another question if they'll start more work, but at this juncture, we've been able to move that. The Mexican tariff was a result of a duty that was placed on U.S. hams and some other products going into Mexico as a result of the failure of the United States to live up to its NAFTA agreements. One of the things in NAFTA was a normalization of truck traffic. That's why if you drive Interstate 80, as I do often, you'll see semi-trucks with Ontario license plates or Saskatchewan license plates. NAFTA normalized that. However, because of union pressure, NAFTA, the U.S. had not really normalized truck traffic from Mexico into the United States. During the Bush administration, there was a pilot project that was bringing that about, that was studying it, but there was more pressure from particularly the Teamsters Union, and what happened was that during a democratically controlled Congress, that program was defunded, and what happened was suddenly there was no truck availability from Mexico into the U.S., and with that, the Mexican government had a NAFTA panel that said that we were in violation, the U.S. was in violation of rules, and were able to put on duties on products from the United States entering Mexico. That happened with pork. Eventually there was a first tranche pork was involved in, and then pork had another tranche. MPPC played, I think, a very key and significant role in getting this reversed. And the duties that MPPC were paying, for those of you in Iowa, what it basically did was it made the differential in transportation from a plant in western Iowa or in Iowa sending hams to Mexico, it made that differential in transportation the same as the plant in Brandon, Manitoba. So in essence, the Canadians could send in product at the same price as the U.S., including transportation, because of the U.S. duty. We were able to get that suspended. When it was first passed in Congress, half of the duty came off, and after it was implemented, the first truck came across the border, the duty went to zero. It has been suspended. It's not been done away with, because the Mexicans have learned their lesson that if the U.S. acts in this type of way again, they would be revisited. But that was very important for us. And interestingly enough, I don't know if anybody's here from Canada, if you take a look at U.S. trade statistics last year, month by month, you can see that decrease in U.S. product into Mexico, and if you look at the corresponding Canadian numbers, you can see the increase in Canadian numbers to Mexico. Obviously, we saw the South Korean, Colombian, and Panama Free Trade Agreements passed by Congress, a long-awaited effort. And Kirk, how long did that started? 5 years ago, 6 years ago, yeah, to get these done, and finally they have been done. Interestingly enough, July 1 of last year, the South Koreans' FTA with the Europeans went into effect, and we still hadn't gotten ours done. Now we're in the phase right now, it's called implementation. The attorneys are looking at what the numbers are, trying to make sure that as trade takes place that all the regulatory things can work, but that implementation hopefully will be taking place before the middle of the year, and we will see duties start to be reduced. Those three free trade agreements, you'll see a slide later, but we estimate, MPPC estimates, after having Dr. Dermot Hayes at Iowa State look at that, that will mean $11 per head when fully implemented. And if you want to take a look, and this was said at the Iowa delegate meeting the other day, you want to take a look at what the down payment on NAFTA was for Korea, with free trade agreements with Korea was. Take a look at this last year with Korea, and I'm going to show you some slides there. But with their FMD situation, they reduced their duties to zero. Interestingly enough, not for the pork industry. It's actually a date certain, 2014, for certain products. It's a 10-year phase-in for frozen hams from the U.S. That's the longest phase-in by that time. And the duties will be reduced proportionally through that time. In the FTA, an interesting thing that got done, that Nick got done, was that normally you say, okay, after the date of implementation, we're going to give it X number of years to be fully implemented. MPPC was able to actually, in the pork side, get a date certain, because this was negotiated in 2006, 2007. We said we want a date certain 2014, that duties will go to zero.
That didn't get pushed back because of the delay?
That did get pushed back. If you remember a year ago, there was a big story about how automobiles didn't like the FTA with Korea, and the Koreans came to the United States and there was a story about how MPPC or how pork producers took one for the team. What MPPC did was we agreed to a delay of that 2014 to 2016. So now we're 4 years away. Normally it's a 5-year implementation. And so we still have an accelerated implementation on some products that are frozen. Fresh chilled will take longer to normalize. And we did quite well relative to other meat proteins in the U.S. Well, what Dermot Hayes tells us is the way he figures it is that he figures what happens after it's fully implemented, and if you lost that market or that much of the market, or you had duties equivalent to what's happening now placed on it, it would cost $11 or over $10 at that time. Actually, that number is probably very conservative. The $11 really comes from $10 that we use for Korea, $1.12 from Colombia, and probably 63 cents from Panama. I will tell you, though, that Dermot was very conservative in his $10 number. We think that will be much greater. And I think if we take a look at the last year, what Korean exports, particularly of shoulders, has done, it's helped our market a lot. Bill, are you going to talk about 145 degree? Okay. MPPC had a bit of a help with this after a lot of work done by the pork board on a new cooking temperature for pork. And just a side note, why is that important? Gee, the government now says you can cook pork to 145. Well, what does that mean? Well, you have to start thinking about what uses that reference point. Health laws, sanitation codes in states and cities. In fact, we've had some states that have run into, after the 145, they've run into having a pork producer tent serving pork at 145 degrees, and the local health inspector says this isn't 160. And they said, USDA just said it's 145. And they said, well, I don't work for USDA, I work for the local city, and we haven't codified our local inspection regs. So there's a lot of work yet to come, but because of research done by the pork board, this has been changed, which has been very beneficial already. A number of the other issues, as I mentioned on the GIPSA rule, that is, it's evolving. It is in a much better position than it has been, but that will continue to be on our radar screen for a while. Mandatory country of origin labeling. The U.S. lost a suit brought by Canada and Mexico on our MCOOL law. The panel ruled last fall. Over this year and probably into next year, there are a lot of issues around MCOOL and getting it fixed, because the end result is this: if the law does not change and is left in place as is, the Canadians and Mexicans will be able to go to the WTO and ask for duties to be placed on the U.S. And the point being, interestingly enough, the Canadian cattle and hog industry brought this suit, and the Canadian and the Mexican cattle industry brought this suit because you have importation of Canadian hogs to the U.S., you have importation of Mexican cattle in the United States, and you have product going into Canada. Interestingly enough, the Mexican pork producers, who we don't import any hogs from, joined the case, and that gives the opportunity that if this doesn't get fixed, we could see duties on our pork going both to Canada and to Mexico. So it's important we get that fixed. MPPC has opposed it since its conception in 2002. The big question is, are we going to see a farm bill this year? A lot of people say, well, gee, why is the pork industry interested in farm bill? Isn't that about crops and things in this order? It is. There is, however, other things in the farm bill that relate directly to the pork industry. One of the more major ones deals with animal health laws and funding of our animal plant health inspection service that we are engaged heavily in. Also, NPPC is taking a position that we need to take a look at. It's a longstanding position NPPC's had to make sure that any non-environmentally sensitive land in the CRP program, Conservation Reserve Program, be allowed to come out into crop production without penalty. Now, it can't be sensitive environmental ground. We're not saying, gee, you got a prairie pothole, let's go farm it. But the way things were done, they're obviously CRP, and a lot of people look at CRP as an environmental program. There was also a land idling program that went with that as a result of the farm crisis of the 80s. And our point with it is given the situation of feed grain availability, if owners decide to bring the crop ground that's reasonable crop ground, not environmentally sensitive, out, then it should be allowed to go into production. That will be a debate. There'll be a number of other debates, including on the grain side of the equation. The question becomes, Debbie Stabenow, head of the Senate Ag Committee, said she wants to have a farm bill by this coming July 1. And they've started hearings and they're working on it. The question remains, this is an election year. It's very difficult to pass farm bills in an election year. One last thing from an ag perspective. Remember, we talk about a farm bill. Of all the spending of the farm bill, remember 77% of the funding in this farm bill goes to feeding programs. SNAP, which is the old food stamps program, women's, infants, and children, and other food nutrition programs make up the bulk of the farm bill. And so the point is there's going to be a lot of challenges with that, and particularly this atmosphere of budget deficits and budget cutting. So stay tuned. We have more CAFO litigation on the way. Part of it is hearings that are comments that are just being filed now related to this electronic database I talked about. Also with that is that we're involved in a lawsuit in the Chesapeake Bay region, and everybody in here is going, why are you in the Chesapeake Bay? It's because of the method that EPA wants to use to manage land use for the environment in the Chesapeake Bay between urban and rural areas, which there have been some very strange things occur from how much is urban, how much is rural, and whose numbers are you going to use. And it's been stated by this administration publicly. Now, recently they've been retracting it, but stating that the Chesapeake Bay will make a perfect guide on how to regulate the Mississippi River watershed, which, as a reminder, the Mississippi River watershed runs from western Pennsylvania to eastern Montana. So the net effect into the Gulf of Mexico. So the point being is we can see large land use questions, and that's why we're engaged in those. Side note, Humane Society of the United States, which a reminder is not your local animal shelter, reached agreement with the United Egg Producers last summer to institute a federal law that would dictate given production practices in the egg industry. Actually, a bill was dropped this Monday in the House Ag Committee. MPPC's position is this is a very dangerous precedent. You're talking national production standards, on-farm production standards by federal law. And MPPC has always opposed that. In fact, we had a situation with the FDA a year ago related to FDA inspectors coming to the farm, which was kind of a result of the situation on eggs in Iowa that had spurred along. MPPC's position is, look, we have to do the right thing. Producers have to be responsible. The industry has to be responsible. But the net effect is we do not need federal mandated law. Issues related to, in this case, animal welfare, which there are no fundamental federal laws on, are best dealt with at the lowest possible level by the producer or on the local level, not on the federal level. And MPPC is aggressively opposed to this. I'd also say on Monday we had other interesting news. If you all remember the pictures of downer cows, dairy cows in California, whether the Westland Hallmark situation, which led to the largest beef recall in the nation's history, which had nothing to do with food safety, but had a lot of people got all excited about it in the federal government, and we had actually millions of pounds of ground beef and beef that would have gone to our school systems that were perfectly safe, ended up in landfills, which is at some juncture, depending on what country you're at and on how much is available to eat, is almost a moral crime. But it was dumped. One of the results of that was a state law that says you had to euthanize a downer animal immediately upon being received at a packing plant. Problem is, anybody who's dealt with pigs knows that pigs don't necessarily always want to do what you would like pigs to do. And putting aside those animals that are injured or crippled or such a disease state that they should be for their own good euthanized, you can get a cantankerous pig. You can get a pig that's a little tuckered out, or you can get a pig that just doesn't want to move along. Should not just be euthanized because it's a fatigued pig or a slow pig or a slightly stressed pig. The net result of that is the National Meat Association took that to local district court. It worked its way through just this one, a stoppage on fatigued pigs in California. It was granted on the local level. HSUS, the animal rights activists, appealed it to the Ninth Circuit, which is the appeal court in San Francisco, which, as Wes will attest, is a very conservative court. I'm being facetious. It's the most liberal appellate court in the country, who then overturned their ruling. It then went to the Supreme Court. The case was argued in early November. On Monday, the justices returned a case 9-0 that the state law was in conflict with federal preemption on inspection, and so the state law, as it relates to this, is set aside. However, the whole case still has yet to work through the system, so there might be more coming on this. But this was very significant, and from reading what Wayne Purcelli wrote on his blog on Tuesday, or on Monday night after the Supreme Court case and after the egg bill was dropped, you saw the reaction. HSUS was not very happy at all. A quick thank you here. One of the things that got the GIPSA rule rethought was the fact that there were over 16,000 comments came specifically from the pork industry saying this rule will not do what you think it's going to do, and it's going to change the atmosphere such it's going to make life very difficult. That stopped the administration in its tracks to take a look at it again. And so thank you for those of you who put comments in. It's a classic example of, you know, we will come to the country to ask for help. We don't want to show up every Monday and say, hey, can you call your congressman? However, it's important that we have the ability to make your voice heard and amplify your voice as we go forward. It says it's conducting a cost-benefit analysis. It actually did do that. That was one of our positions. They had the proposed rule would have had, in some estimates, over 100 or over $250 million worth of impact in the U.S. pork industry on an annual basis. There was no cost and benefit analysis done when this was proposed. So with that, I'm going to move on. Just a side note, I mentioned that one of the funding sources of MPPC is the SIP program, which is the equivalent of 10 cents on $100 of value sold. Currently, there are 2,600 investors. Now, those 2,600 investors represent tens of thousands of farm families. That those investors, we discovered something very rapidly, and that is, you know, it's very easy to get a LLC suddenly of three guys together, and that's who would be contributed. So the net effect of it is they've been very successful. We've been successful, and we've got about 65% of the pigs contribute to our legislative efforts. This last year in Iowa, we had 55 new investors. The most investors in the industry are in Iowa, 526 investors that fund MPPC. And also our LEADR program, which is a legislative action program that we work with coordinating producers, and we do small training sessions, take about 2 to 3 hours, talk about the interface and how we can work. We have about 1,000 LEADR members over the course of the country. There's 252 in Iowa. We had 20 new folks from Iowa show up. If you're not a person that's a leader, please see Leon or see me. I'd ask your help. We try to do this. We do some basic training on what we're trying to do, but we don't try to take a lot of your time. But there are times when we have to put a call out that we have to get word in, and these are the folks we rely to really spur up and get response. So, and we could use some help in eastern Iowa, in Representative Braley and Representative Lobsap's district, but we'll take help throughout the state, throughout the country. This coming year, we're going to have all elections all the time. I think we're already seeing that with just the primaries going on, the Republican side, just recently the State of the Union address. A lot of discussion about legislate, regulate, or punt. Typically during election years, a lot of things don't happen, don't occur. However, this is one of the concerns we have on this HSUS UEP bill. There is the possibility that something could occur some night when there's very few people in the chambers. They say, let's do unanimous consent, and if somebody hasn't prepared for this, we could end up getting the HSUS bill. And I tell you, the other concern with it is, depending on who you have and whose agenda they have, they just say, well, let's also do away with gestation stalls, and let's in fact make a new law as it relates to square footage and a whole bunch of other things. Somebody with ulterior motives. So we're watching that closely. Big question, who's driving the bus? Get ready for another debt ceiling debate here coming the end of this, or end of next month and into March. And we do anticipate more gridlock generally. Just a number of things going on. Feed availability is important. And mentioned the CAFA database. There's other kinds of things on liability questions on third-party manure management issue on this order. We've got the air emissions study, and the federal government's still trying to figure out what regulations and methods going to use to do data related to what they're going to use as far as the data analysis of the air emissions study on gases released by livestock operations. I've already mentioned a lot of these. One of the things, if you happen to have land in Iowa, and you do, there's talk about permitting drainage tile, just so you know, on the federal level, potentially coming out of EPA. Before you put any fencing tile down, you go through a process of permitting for it. So, heads up. Really not a pork industry issue, other than the fact, of course, it has some ramifications on manure handling, but it's certainly a grain issue. Number of things happening on food safety issues that we watch, or science and technology issues. And one thing I put forward here, this guidance 209, we expect to see something happening with that. What it is the FDA is going to basically look at, they've been looking at subtherapeutic levels of antibiotic labeling. Normally labeled, the original labels they had were under the title of growth promotion, because people didn't understand exactly what was happening and why the animals did better. Gee, do you think it might have been they were healthier? But the net effect of it is FDA has been looking at that. They're looking at potentially bringing forward a new guidance on how that's regulated, which most likely will mean restricted access to certain antibiotic classes. VFD stands for the Veterinary Feed Directive. It means, how do you manage this? How does the producer manage that? A veterinary feed directive means before either the feed has medication mixed to it, or before you medicate through water, that you would have to have a veterinary prescription. You can understand what the hassle of that would be if you had to have a veterinary prescription for every load of feed. That's why we're working on what's the proper way. Can it be done electronically? How do we do it? Again, we have to do the right stuff. We have to provide a high quality, safe product to the consumer, great value. But again, some of the stuff becomes burdensome. The other thing I just mentioned is, actually there's a PDUFA, a Human Pharmaceutical Drug User Fee Act bill that will pass this year, or that will be up for authorization this year. That's on the human pharmaceutical side. That's where we see things like Pamto. It says we're going to outlaw any antibiotics being fed to animals that are used in human medicine. That will lead into the discussion of the reauthorization of a DUFA next year. We don't see that happening. We don't see that banning happening on the human side this year, but it will get discussed, and there will be an attempt made. And interestingly enough, anybody understand, well, I know Mark Stapleman knows this, where a DUFA came from? A DUFA was established by the animal health companies as a way to get more breaking edge science products to the marketplace because of the backlog our government has going through things. And this is a case where the animal health companies pay the federal government to review the research they've done. But now it's going to be used, it's being used for other purposes, in this case, issues related to antibiotics. How am I doing, Bill? I got a little bit of time left. Let me just talk briefly about, I just want to talk a little bit, every group I talk about, and part of this goes to, first, the world's changed. I think we all know that. Things are a lot different today than they were when I grew up. But there's a tremendous amount of change occurring, and this is also one of the benefits for the young people in this audience. I think long term, I am so optimistic about the opportunities in agriculture in the future. And I want to get to part of this and give you a little perspective on it. Just a side note. This orange line, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, is at 2,800 calories of food produced per capita daily by a country. And this orange line means that your country has reached food security if you can produce that food. And the blue line on top is for what the developed world has done. Gee, the U.S., you know, we talk about abundance, we feed the world, Europe, other developed countries. But below this red line is what the world has averaged throughout the world. And in 2006, finally, the world became a place where it had food security. It produced enough food to consume. And then the issue became who's going to consume what, where. And that's basic food security. These other lines you see below it are Africa, Asia, and others. Now, the UN projects by the year 2050 that we're going to increase the world population somewhere around 9 billion. Actually, the low ranges are a little about 8 billion, and the upper range nears 11 billion. But we're gonna have an increase of at least 30% more people, more mouths to feed between now and 2050. And the UN is also saying that not only will we have more mouths to feed, we're going to have to double food production. Okay? Now, where's that population coming from? That blue area in the bottom are developed nations. The population growth is coming from less developed countries, obviously India, Africa, etc. So we're going to see a lot more people, and there's going to be a real demand for food. With that, just a perspective, and I want to give you another perspective on this one. The anticipation by the UN is that we're going to see this huge trend continue in population growth going to urban areas, okay? And rural areas, and this is happening in China right now, people are migrating from the country into the cities, which has given the Chinese government some dynamics to deal with. But the point being is our rural populations probably are about peaked out. We're going to be about as densely populated in rural areas except for around major metropolitan areas. A side note of this, do you think that has any bearing in the future when you have that kind of urban population that relies on you to produce food, on their interest in telling you how to do things? So there's going to be a pressure there long term that we're going to have to remember. But I just want to put that thought in your mind as we go forward, because it's not just, gee, times will be great, but it'll also be, there will be dynamics we're going to have to deal with. Here's the one I really want to put forward, though, and this is just the types of calories consumed in the world. And it moves from left to right. If you can't see in the back, it goes from 1979-81 to projections for 2030. And this doesn't even go to 2050 yet. I just want you to take a look, however, at this orange area. That's meat. That's projected. That's real and projected meat consumption per capita. Okay. So the net effect, and this is done on an annualized basis, but the point being is, I just showed you the chart. We're going to have more people, but the projections are they're going to eat more meat. Okay. So that's why I'm very optimistic about the future in this industry and livestock production. The question becomes one, will it be in this country or somewhere else? Now, being optimistic, I want to point this out. And this is the food price index from the Food and Agriculture Organization based in Italy, but it's part of UN. And the point is that we're on an uptrend. And if you're an economist, you can take a straight line and just draw a straight line into the future on the uptrend. But for the producers in this group, just a reminder, the uptrend is upward. The issue is the realities will be this way. We're going to have peaks and we're going to have valleys. And that's risk management. We're going to have times we're going to lose money. We're going to have times we're going to make money. Generally, over time, we're going to grow. But it isn't just unbridled optimism. It is the managed risk and managed optimism. A quick one about our exports. Every time we get a free trade agreement, we get increased exports. These are the export numbers for pork and pork variety meats. That would be, normally we call those offals: livers, lungs, tongues, brains, faces, ears. This year versus last year. One thing I'll point out, our exports in volume to Korea this past year, because of their foot and mouth disease situation, went from 163,000 metric tons through November of 2010 to 452,000 tons. 177% increase in export volume. On the export value, it increased by 126%. And you can just kind of peruse that quickly. Japan increased Part of that was the tsunami situation. The U.S. MPPC and Pork Board were some of the first in the country to donate money into the relief funds because of the importance of the Japanese market to us. Mexico had a slight increase in volume, but a slight decrease in value. And remember what I said, that's in a year where we, for almost 3/4 of the year, had a duty on our pork going into Mexico. So we did well. Anyway, the net effect is we ended up November, 29% increase in volume year over year, 18% increase in value. But the critical thing was our exports at the end of October set a new annual export record for U.S. pork. So the second 2 months of the year are just going to increase the size of that. So very great success. If you're interested, you can take a look at these. These are just where the value is year over year, done graphically. Of course, the value on Japan and Mexico is in Canada. Hong Kong is higher. Russia's been an interesting market. You'll see the peak we talked about in South Korea. And a little bit of changes here. Russia, our volumes actually went down a little bit. Our volumes in Mexico, this is not quite, well, on a year-to-year basis, we're down a little bit through November in Mexico. In Japan, we had great increases. And finally, it's estimated by Dermot Hayes at Iowa State, 23% of the muscle meat produced in 2011 exported out of the country. That means basically, and 27% if you include the offals. The net effect of that is 1 out of every 4 pigs. So when you look in the barn, 1 out of every 4, the meat from those animals, 1 out of every 4 is destined internationally. And Dermot Hayes' projection this past year is $55. The value of every hog sold, $55 of that animal's value is a result of exports. Okay? Very quickly, I talked about the free trade agreements that are in the process going forward. You're going to talk about Farmer Ranch Alliance, I assume. MPPC is a part of this. A lot of entities have involved. The reason that MPPC is involved with this, the old adage, gee, most American consumers are two generations off the farm. I'd submit they're probably 4 or 5 generations away from the farm now. And unfortunately, the reverse is true. Most farmers are probably 4 to 5 generations removed from thinking about consumer issues. And the point is we have to have a good dialogue because, as I said, you have more people in urban areas wanting to dictate the kinds of issues that you're going to have to dictate in producing food.